Hi folks, thanks for taking the time to join us today for the launch of our brand new EESSH2 framework. For those of you who don't know, my name is Chris McGinn. I'm Commercial Manager for PfH Scotland. I'm joined today by Jonathan Burke, Scotland and Northern Ireland Manager for Elmhurst Energy, who's going to give a short presentation on PAS 2035 and EESSH2 from a policy perspective, before we move on to a brief introduction from myself on the framework itself. My colleague James Lines, who pulled the framework together, is here in the background to assist with any questions, which I'll ask you to keep till the end. And for your information, the session is being recorded and we'll ensure each and every one of you are sent a link to the session along with a copy of the framework buyer's guide in the coming days. Before I hand over to Jonathan, we'd like to conduct a quick poll, which you should hopefully be able to see on your screen now. If I can ask you to take the time to answer the questions, we'll leave that there for a few seconds. Thank you very much. Probably not overly surprised with those results, but thank you for taking the time. And I will now hand over to Jonathan.
Hi, Chris. Thank you very much indeed. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for coming along this afternoon. And to our friends over at PfH Scotland for inviting me along. I'm Jonathan Burke, the Area Manager for Scotland and Northern Ireland at Elmhurst, and I'll be giving a quick overview today of the EESSH2 standard itself from an energy efficiency perspective, and covering off some of the considerations around PAS 2035. As well as that, I'll have a look at what can be done to help support you as PfH Scotland clients in terms of the services on offer by Elmhurst member firms. So many of you will be familiar with Elmhurst as your EPC provider scheme of choice for many, many years. But for those of you who aren't, we've been on the go for just coming up for 30 years. We have risen over that period of time to become the #1 leading accreditation scheme or approved organisation for EPCs throughout the UK, with a very enviable market share up here in Scotland. And a lot of that is down to the existing relationship that we have with many providers within registered social landlords. We are part of the FENA group of businesses, who are an international conglomerate of those firms involved in testing, inspection, compliance and certification, and currently boast a membership of around about 7,500 energy assessors of various types, whether that's domestic, commercial or those involved in new build. The core business that Elmhurst offers really rests on what you can see on screen here that I'll refer to as our golden triangle, if you like. So we're heavily focused in the training and competence and CPD considerations for the energy assessor community within the UK. Many of you as PfH Scotland clients are direct members of Elmhurst yourselves. You may have an in-house resource, or you choose to outsource to an Elmhurst member firm, mainly due to the link and the integration that EPCs have with your own asset management software. And that runs like a thread through everything that we do. We provide our own bespoke software out to Elmhurst member firms to enable them to conduct a compliant job as efficiently as possible for you. But having a look at EESSH2, what are the sort of key aims of this standard as it applies to social housing in Scotland? Well, fundamentally, as you all know, it's about looking at the energy efficiency of the stock that you have under management, and what can be done to help improve the overall efficiency of that. That can be done through many different ways, depending on the objectives that you have within any programs that you set, but typically looking at reducing energy consumption, improving the fabric of the building, and reducing the fuel poverty rates of for the tenants that currently are provided accommodation by you. Now, the standard, the EESSH2 standard itself is set through various enabling contracts that are enabling legislations that are in place. So typically the Climate Change Emissions Reduction Targets Scotland Act, where there's an obligation for us here in Scotland to achieve net zero by 2045, in and of itself then shapes and informs some of the other daughter legislation that comes along, EESSH2 being typical of that. We also have to take into account what's been set out in the Heat and Building Strategy and the Housing to 2040 route map that have been recently published by the Scottish Government. And within that, we have a lot of guidance over the various targets that have to be met along the way, both in terms of backstop dates to achieving the target and overall compliance with EESSH2 in and of itself. But in addition to that, there'll also be a review of EESSH2 taking place in the year after next, which will also look at air quality and alignment with the overall objectives of our obligation to hit net zero as a country. But in terms of the energy efficiency considerations around this, many of you will be familiar with EPC Band B being the objective to have achieved within the majority of your stock by December 2032, where practically possible and within the limits of any cost, technology and consents that will apply. But another significant milestone to have to consider under EESSH2 is that no social housing should be re-let if it's below an EPC Band D from December 2025 onwards, again, subject to some temporary specified exemptions. The review that will take place within that year will also assess any additional requirements that will need to be adopted within EESSH2 to help escalate and expedite any requirements to meet the standard by 2032. When we then look at procuring services through the PfH Scotland framework, when it comes to actually delivering on the EESSH2 standard, it's absolutely critical that the correct plan takes place within your stock in terms of what will be done to the properties within that, what sort of tenant engagement will take place along the way. And there are also a few key reference points which must be identified and addressed as part of the process. So quite typically, there are additional requirements in place to look at traditional buildings or hard to treat properties, making sure that any measures that are recommended are technically appropriate. Some of the insulation measures that might be suitable for modern buildings can't be used within traditional properties. And that can even relate to any significant surveys that take place within traditional buildings, which may be those constructed before 1919. The other major consideration, which is of fundamental importance when you're at the planning stage of the project, is to be aware that very often when we look at decarbonisation or mass electrification of any heating, it might not always lower the bills for tenants. And that can be of particular significance when we look at any objectives to meet fuel poverty obligations or your own desire as a social landlord to minimise or eradicate fuel poverty among the tenants who are currently your own residents. Now, one way that EESSH2 is to be delivered is through adherence to the PAS 2035 standard, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of that together with some of the significant roles within the process. But in terms of PAS 2035, the background towards of this was from a parliamentary review that took place a few years ago, the Bonfield Review, which in and of itself became the Each Home Counts Review, where 27 recommendations were made back to industry about what can be done to improve the overall domestic retrofit process within the UK. This is to involve the adoption of a quality mark to ensure that proper works have been done in the correct manner and in the correct sequence for tenants and for clients. And the overarching principle behind this is to restore confidence in the eyes of consumers and at government level that a correct standard has been followed, which is designed to meet the overarching objectives of whatever programme of works have been mapped out, without necessarily following a particular measure-led approach as we may have seen before. Ultimately, PAS 2035 is a set of quality standards, and running like a thread throughout this is the importance of a whole building approach being taken into account, particularly focused on the importance of the fabric being treated first. But at the same time, one of the maxims that's come along from it is around the build tight, ventilate right philosophy, because it's natural, as you would expect, as you make a building more and more energy efficient, better insulated, and you focus on the building envelope in itself. There are a number of considerations of relevance when it comes to the ventilation implications of that. So this is where setting the plan from the get-go and the programme of works must be holistic, must take into account the future plans of what you have in mind. It must be set to last for the duration, which may be up to 30 years. And it's also imperative that you, as clients, and also the tenants and all other parties involved within the process communicate responsibly and are constantly aware of what's going on throughout. Now, the way that that's done is through some significant roles that have been created through the PAS 2035 process. Now, I'll not run through all of this slide in detail, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of the significant roles within it. The two highlighted on screen there, the retrofit coordinator and retrofit assessors, are very much where Elmhurst comes into play on this, as we operate both a retrofit coordinator and a retrofit assessor competency scheme. Now, the retrofit coordinator is the linchpin in the process. That's the person who will act as the overall project manager, who'll engage with you from the start, oversee all works throughout, and check that everything's been done in the correct manner. They'll do that through initially involving the services of a retrofit assessor, who must be an accredited domestic energy assessor, to go out and gather the information from the property that will help assist in the creation of the plan. But one interesting part to touch upon here is that there's no blocker within the PAS towards one individual person fulfilling multiple roles within the process. This particular slide I've put together is designed to give you an idea of the way the information flows throughout, and will hopefully highlight to you the importance of the retrofit coordinator within the process. You'll see that initially that's the individual person or organisation who will engage with you as a client. They'll appoint the retrofit assessor to go out and provide them with the information that's needed. They'll then liaise with whoever's putting together the design of measures or package of measures that will take place, designed by someone competent to do so. They'll then discuss that with you or with the tenants in certain situations. And then at that point, then the installer will be instructed to go out and complete the works, and before passing back to the coordinator to confirm compliance with the standard through adequate evaluation. Various reports will result, so you'll be familiar that the retrofit assessment will provide you with an EPC, but in addition to that, it will also consider the condition of the property. That will be reported back to the coordinator, together with an occupancy assessment, which takes into account how the tenant uses their electricity. It may involve the analysis of bill data and heating patterns and so on and so forth. And that's all then collated together with discussions with you to create this 30-year plan for the property. Now, the plan itself is then lodged at Trustmark within their data warehouse. So that's submitted through Elmhurst software and then makes its way over to the data warehouse that will effectively act as a central repository for that information. But there are additional reports that can be available and can be produced as part of the process, in particular around air permeability testing results and any significant survey that's been conducted on traditional or historic or protected buildings. But a fundamental part to the PAS 2035 process is around evaluation and ensuring that what's been done and what's been planned and what your objectives are have been delivered upon. And we have a number of software solutions in place for retrofit coordinators, together with additional guidance and training to ensure that they themselves are empowered with being able to make sure that your objectives have been met. And I'm more than happy to discuss absolutely any parts of that with anyone offline, together with any Q&A at the end of today's session. So that's a very quick overview of the PAS 2035 process, and in particular how that fits in with the EESSH2 standard. Please make a note of my contact details, and as I say, reach out anytime I can be of help, and I will look forward to answering any questions that any of you might have after Chris has delivered on his section. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Folks, for your information, we have had some very slight technical difficulties with control of the presentation. So whilst Jonathan was very slick there and was able to move things along himself, he is remaining in control of the presentation. So if you hear me asking him to move things along, that's why. It's not because I can't multitask. Jonathan, if I could ask you to move it along to the next slide, please, if you don't mind. Okay, okay. Folks, my intention is to run through this fairly quickly and we can get to questions at the end. I'm sure there's plenty bubbling away. Hopefully most of you have got a reasonable awareness of PfH Scotland by now. I've been with us for a couple of years, and looking at the attendees list, I know the vast majority of people on there, and I know I've spoken to you. But just in case, for those who don't have an awareness, and before we get to the framework, I will go through who we are, what we do very, very quickly, just to give you an understanding of everything that we can offer. Jonathan, you can move that along, please. So why PfH Scotland, first of all? Well, to give you some background to who we are, we were created in 2004 in partnership with Housemarque and CIH, and we're managed by the Improver Group. Over the years, we've changed from being and just providing transactional frameworks, and we now offer what we consider to be a full wraparound value proposition, which incorporates frameworks, dynamic purchasing systems, technology, and consultancy services. We look to provide a bespoke level of service for each and every one of our members, which is based on their own individual needs and expectations. And we can offer a flexible and fully blended approach to their procurement needs, supported with full end-to-end contract management and call-off support if required, to be honest, and to a level that none of our competitors in Scotland can currently match. All of this requires the right people in post to make it happen, and we take pride in investing heavily in ours. Day to day, if you're engaging with PfH Scotland, it's myself you'll be dealing with. Like I say, I know most of you on here. I'd like to think that most of you think that I'm easily contactable, pretty responsive. But if there's any reason you can't get me, or if I don't know the answer, then there's a team of 50 people behind me who are very well versed and very experienced in all things public sector procurement. We've got a membership of 95 local authorities and housing associations in Scotland at the moment, and over 900 throughout the UK. I think these numbers demonstrate our credibility and strength within the sector, and I think it's also fair to say that we're now seen by many of our members as their preferred and trusted procurement advisors. To give you some further indication of the success that we are enjoying, we now manage over £50 million in spend for our members, with over 200 live contracts being managed at any one time. And we can boast consistent year-on-year growth of approximately 12 to 15%. And I'm pleased to say this has continued in spite of the pandemic we've been experiencing in the last couple of years. Jonathan? We currently manage 25 frameworks and 3 dynamic purchasing systems. I won't go through them all in detail, but you can see there the categories that they fall under. And these have all been developed in conjunction with our members to some degree. In particular, we've got a real focus and strength on the planned works category, and that's where we've seen exponential growth over the last couple of years. And it's under this category that the EESSH2 framework obviously falls. Jonathan, can you move that along, please? This is actually a retender of our original EESSH framework. Our first stab at the EESSH framework ran from 2017 until September this year. And it was brought in to assist landlords to meet the original EESSH targets. It was a good framework, which covered EPCs and a variety of individual measures, such as heating installations and renewable installations. But if I'm being honest, it didn't really allow for a joined-up approach from consultancy all the way through to project delivery. And where it did, it was very bitty. It was quite involved. And also, there was no scope for insulation under the terms of the framework, which, given the fact that EESSH is a fabric-first approach, wasn't ideal. We could make it work through renewables frameworks, but there wasn't just this joined up approach and joined up route to market. In spite of this, the framework proved to be very successful. We had numerous contracts worth tens of millions of pounds, which were procured during its lifetime throughout the country. And one of them is actually shown in the picture. For those of you who follow myself or PfH Scotland on LinkedIn, or North Glasgow Homes or McDermott Group, I'm sure you have an awareness of this. The picture showing air source heat pumps, which were installed on top of 6 26-storey tower blocks by North Glasgow as part of a massive upgrade programme, including fire door installations, sprinkler systems, Internet of Things, all of which was procured through ourselves. The air source heat pump aspect on the project will cut energy consumption by over 70% compared to the last system, and the project itself aims to achieve savings in heating costs by up to 60%. So all in all, definitely a worthwhile exercise, particularly for the end user, for the tenant. The contract itself was procured on a direct award basis, and I think that this showcased the strength of using a framework by allowing a quality contractor to get involved at an early a stage as possible and to manage the whole process from start to finish. As this framework came to its natural conclusion earlier this year, the challenge for my colleague James and myself was to take its strong points forward into the new framework, improving its weaknesses and align the new offering as closely as possible with the requirements of the sector, to try and offer a platform for housing associations and local authorities to access the technical expertise and experienced contractors required to meet the EESSH2 challenge. Jonathan? Our first step was to carry out an in-depth pre-tender exercise to get feedback from the market as to what was required. I think it's fair to say, and we hold our hands up to this, that in years gone by, that's not something we've been brilliant in Scotland. And since James and myself have come on board, it's something we have improved drastically, and it's now a key aspect that every tender process we undertake, and it's something we pride ourselves on doing properly. So with this one, initially we engaged with 20 of our members who between them own or manage over a third of Scottish social housing stock. And conversations with them gave us a real flavour of the pressures being felt by our clients and what they'd like to see within a framework to help alleviate these. Next, we moved on to speak with a large cross-section of our existing suppliers to try and get similar feedback from their point of view in an effort to make the framework as well-rounded as we possibly could, before we moved on to conduct a webinar with the Supplier Development Programme, of which we're members, really in an attempt to make the framework as attractive and accessible to SMEs as we possibly could. We work very closely with the Energy Agency. For those of you who don't know, they're a charitable organisation who provide expert advice to households, businesses and communities covering energy efficiency and renewable energy. And with them, we work really closely delivering HEAPS ABS programmes in Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway. They provided really valuable advice on the challenges currently facing the sector and those on the horizon, particularly around past 2035, which Jonathan has just covered. And finally, we moved on to speak with Elmhurst Energy. I think given the very technical nature of this framework, it made absolute sense to speak to such an experienced organisation, and they provided invaluable support in pulling the framework together. Jonathan? Next, we move on to the tender process. We started looking at this around about this time last year, and we got around to publishing the PIN notice in April of this year before we got the contract notice on Public Contract Scotland very, very shortly thereafter. We then obviously undertook an in-depth tender process before the framework was awarded on December 1st this year. As you can see from the figures on screen, the tender itself attracted massive interest among suppliers. I think it's the most we've ever seen as an organisation, in fact. And I think that shows just how important this framework's got the potential to be. For me, one of the key figures on screen and one of the most pleasing figures is that you can see there the dominance of SMEs across the framework suppliers. Framework itself was tendered on a 70-30 quality price split, and following feedback received during the pre-tender exercise, it was broken down into a raft of regionalised individual measures and a national retrofit lot using NatFed schedule rates version 7.1 and 7.2 and taking into account the new PAS 2035 standards. Jonathan, would you mind clicking that on, please? One of the most common themes to come out of a pre-tender exercise, and a conversation that James and I had with, I would say, almost all of the 20 members that we spoke to, was that Scottish Government are very good at making funding available, but unfortunately not quite so good at letting people know when it's coming out, and probably even worse at giving realistic timescales in which to submit what are quite often arduous applications. We were told that in an ideal world, local authorities and housing associations would be able to engage with specialist organisations who are capable of carrying out EESSH2 modelling, feasibility studies, so on and so forth on their stock, and to include the services of retrofit assessors and coordinators to allow them to have effectively oven-ready projects on the shelf and good to go, so that as and when funding applications come out and go online, they're in a position to make applications. And when they want to make these applications, they can use the same suppliers to complete them on their behalf. And that's what we've really tried to achieve with Lot 1A. And I think we've seen a great deal of success with that. Lots 1B through to 1G, these are individual measures, and they're regionalised to make them as attractive as possible to suppliers who are keen to work in specific areas. And again, thanks to the engagement that we undertook at the pre-tender stage, we've managed to gain coverage and competition across all areas. And finally, Lot 2, that's our retrofit lot. It was tendered on a national basis, and there's 9 suppliers on the lot covering the whole country. And the measures on there, as you'd expect, are vast, and they include, but are not limited to, EWI, IWI, roofing insulation, flooring insulation, primary and secondary heating, renewables, glazing, door insulation, the list goes on. It's really, really comprehensive, and pleased with the outcome. The aim when we set out was to offer a framework that allows for real end-to-end service and can be revisited again and again and again as progress is made. And I'm confident with the structure we've put together and the suppliers who have been successful will manage to achieve this. Jonathan, could you click on the suppliers, please? Folks, as you can see on here, there's 25 suppliers awarded to the framework. And I think there's a good mix between what you probably class as the usual suspects and a few fresh faces, which I think can only be good for the market, especially in the current circumstances we face. As I touched on earlier, over 85% of the suppliers awarded fall into the SME category. And what we'll do is, I said at the start, we'll send the buyer's guide out after this presentation. There's a breakdown of the suppliers who are awarded to each lot in ranking order on there. So don't worry about writing these down, memorising them, wondering what the split is. But what I'll do is I'll leave it up here for another 10, 15 seconds as I talk, just to let you have a good look at that. If there are any suppliers, particularly smaller organisations who you don't see on there, but you think would be a good fit to work with PfH Scotland, who'd like to give the opportunity to tender for any works you may have going forward. Obviously, the framework's now closed. There's not much we can do in that regard for the next 4 years, but it is our intention to put a retrofit dynamic purchasing system in place later this year, so maybe more suited to them. So if there are any that I have in mind, I'm sure we'll speak in the future. That's a conversation we can have. Jonathan, would you mind? So there's 2 call-off methods available from the framework, as you'd expect: direct awards and mini competition. I'm sure most of you are pretty well versed in how those work now. Just to clarify, direct awards can be made to the #1 ranked supplier on any lot based on their position as #1 ranked supplier, most economically advantageous tender. And if the top ranked supplier isn't available, then this will move on to the second ranked, and so on and so forth. In addition, if a client feels they have robust justification for awarding to a supplier who's not ranked at #1, then this is something we can look at and something we can potentially facilitate as well. With regards to mini competitions, these can be run between all suppliers on a lot. The award weighting criteria can be used, and just as a reminder, that's 70% quality, 30% price, but they can be varied within reason if as a member sees fit. I think the mini comps where PfH Scotland can really add value to the process compared to a lot of our competitors. Whilst others will give you a route to market, and for the most part then leave you to it, we can offer assistance with template call-off documentation, specifications, assistance pulling the documentation together, assistance with evaluation, and also contract implementation and support. And it's worth noting that we don't specify which contract type has to be used. One of the the key advantages of using a framework is speed and efficiency and route to market. The last thing we want to do is specify a contract type when then gets to a solicitor or then gets to the tail end and it's decided that it's not being used. So we're completely flexible in that regard. And I think all of that together is what really sets us apart from our competitors. It's our end-to-end contract advice and assistance, and it's designed to be as flexible and as straightforward as we can possibly make it. Jonathan? And finally, from me, I've added contact details up here for myself and James. Feel free to note them down. As you say, the recording will be sent out. Most of you will have them anyway. But if there's any queries that you have with regards to the framework that you're not comfortable raising in the Q&A, you don't have time or for whatever, feel free to pick up the phone, drop us an email, and we'll be happy to assist. And Jonathan, if you can flick that on, that is me. Okay, folks.
So we've had a few questions in. If you're ready to answer, if anyone wants to ask a question, if you move your mouse to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little button called Q&A. If you want to put your questions in there, and we'll fill those to the speakers. But a question that came in beforehand is, should the retrofit coordinator be independent of the installer? I don't know who wants to take that question.
One for Jonathan, I think.
Yes, I don't mind. Yes, and thank you very much to whoever's asked that classic question that's been mooted for quite a while, actually, since the PAS came out. And as a retrofit coordinator accreditation scheme with roughly half of our members being independent and the other half being directly employed by installers. Forgive me for a wee bit of diplomacy and how I go about answering that. Independent retrofit coordinators will very often pose that question as a way of suggesting their degree of impartiality and perhaps acting without any pressure to fulfill works. And then similarly, those employed by installers might counter that by saying that the in-house resource allows for a greater degree over cost. And also, I suppose, philosophically, how independent can anyone truly be in a finite marketplace? But what I very often do when I approach that question is to think, what is it asking? And ultimately, it's asking about conflicts of interest, let's face it. So if you reframe it along the lines of what can be done to prevent conflicts of interest within the PAS between the coordinator, the installer, and any of the other participants, there's a very simple solution to that, and it comes down to auditing. Now, we'll audit retrofit coordinators, whether they're independent or they're directly employed, to the same degree, in the same manner, to the same frequency, without any fear or favour. And similarly, our friends over at Trustmark will do the same. And in fact, when a retrofit coordinator lodges a job into the data warehouse, they have to disclose the Trustmark license numbers of all the other participants involved in the process. And that allows a lot of analysis of the sort of metadata, if you like, of who's acting on behalf of who. So you can rest assured when it comes to auditing that both us and Trustmark are watching. I hope that goes some way to answer.
Thanks, Jonathan. Another question that's come in is around retrofit assessment. And the question is, what level of detail will be included in the condition report? What level of tenant engagement and involvement will there be needed in the occupancy assessment?
That's a great couple of questions there. In terms of the level of detail, the condition report, similar to an RD SAP assessment for an EPC or an energy report, is non-intrusive visual inspection of the property. There's no requirement to open up or to drill or to look to that level within the property. However, there's a lot more information that is captured during a condition assessment. So photographs is one of the most fundamental parts that are collected by the retrofit assessor, and that's photos of all elements to the building, whether that's the elevations or inside rooms, including some rooms that may not be fully assessed as part of an RD SAP assessment. particular areas of focus will be around damp, mould, condensation, of what can be done to prevent the occurrence of that post-retrofit. And in terms of the tenant engagement, what happens is the retrofit assessor conducts an occupancy assessment as part of the retrofit assessment process. Now, there are some default values that can be used in terms of the number of occupants of the property, number of bedrooms and so on and so forth, and the ages of people living there. But it's possible as well for you as a client to instruct a full occupancy assessment, which will take into account looking at the tenant's bills, their heating patterns, the number of appliances and so on and so forth. That's generally cascaded from you via the retrofit coordinator onto the assessor, and generally will be done as a way of ascertaining fuel poverty, incidence rates, and what can be done to minimise or eradicate within your tenants. So ultimately it's up to you, but that's where the consultancy lot comes into its own. And when you're engaging with the retrofit coordinator, they'll be able to advise and guide on what level of occupancy assessment would be appropriate.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. There's another couple of questions. I think they're probably aimed at Chris here or James. The first one is, what do we need to do in order to access the framework? Chris, you're on mute, by the way.
Sorry, I was getting a bit of feedback earlier. Yeah, really straightforward. Make contact with myself or James. Give us details. Myself in the first instance. Give us some details of what it is you're looking to achieve, and we can advise what's the most appropriate lot and how we take things forward.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Some questions are coming in thick and fast. So the next question is there a criteria on what would be an acceptable exemption for failing to meet 2025 targets? Who would like to take that?
I think that's one for Jonathan again.
Jonathan?
Yes, and it's one I'll pick up offline and come back. Bear with me 1 second. I see your details there, Ross. I'll make a note of that and I'll come back with more information for you.
Okay. Let's go to the next one then. How qualified are the retrofit assessor? Is the retrofit assessor to carry out condition reports? Do they come from a background that allows a more detailed knowledge of building construction?
Yeah, so essentially the retrofit assessor must be an accredited domestic energy assessor to begin with. Because the retrofit assessment itself is a visual, non-intrusive gathering of information, they are trained. They'll undergo an additional training course provided by us to be deemed as being competent as a retrofit assessor, together with being provided with the adequate software that will help assist them to collect that information, to process it and get it over to the retrofit coordinator. They don't necessarily need to come from a building surveying background, for example, to answer that part of your question, but they will be adequately trained and qualified to conduct the requirements of the PAS.
All right, thank you. And then one last question is, has the framework been tendered under the PAS 2035 pricing?
I can answer that one. Yes, it has. We used the latest version NatFed scheduler rates, which incorporated all of the new requirements into the specification.
Okay, thank you. And another question's popped up. Will PAS 2035 apply to all planned refurbishment works, such as replacement roofs, render kitchens, bathrooms, windows and doors, and heating? You've all gone quiet. Who'd like to take that one? Do you want me to repeat the question?
Yeah,
if you don't mind, cheers.
Okay, will PAS 2035 apply to all planned refurbishment works, such as replacement roofs, render, kitchens, bathrooms, etc.?
I'd have to take that offline. Obviously, it's relating to all the energy efficiency measures, the roof and insulation items. Decide on the side of yes, it will. how far that stretches into the kitchens and bathroom side of things, I'd have to look at the full scope of the work, but I'll take the details down and come back to you on that one.
Okay, thanks, James. Right, I can't see any other questions. So shall we launch our last poll?
Yeah.
So our last poll is kind of just to see how your thoughts have changed since the beginning of this webinar. So after viewing these presentations, has your confidence in being able to meet EESSH requirements increased, stayed the same, or decreased? So it'd be good to get your feedback on that. Is everybody seeing that? I'm not seeing anyone answering the poll. Okay. Thank you. Okay, back to you then, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Lucinda. Once again, folks, thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. I know everybody's busy. Oh, hold on, I think we may have another question coming up here. Oh, sorry, we're getting feedback on the poll. Lucinda,
okay, shall I try it again?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's good.
At least it hasn't decreased for anyone.
Yes.
No, it's not to panic. Okay, guys, once again, thank you very much for joining us. As we've said throughout this, there'll be recordings made available, which will be coming to you in the coming days, along with copies of the buyer's guide. My contact details are on there. If you've got any queries at all, anything you want to discuss regarding your EESSH2 requirements, please feel free to get in touch and we can get something in the diary. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Thanks very much.
Cheers.